Welcome back, everybody, to Conversations with Therapists. I'm joined by Lindsey Stewart. Lindsey, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
I'd love if you could share a little bit about your background and what led you to work so closely with survivors of narcissistic abuse.
So, for years, I have been drawn to working with abuse and crime survivors, and I sort of had a concurrent clinical interest and honestly fascination with personality disorders, complex trauma, and kind of challenging family systems and interpersonal dynamics. And over time, some patterns began to emerge in my clients. I began to see that many of my clients with the most challenging and difficult to treat issues and interpersonal problems were typically dealing with a narcissist or another similar antagonistic and difficult to treat personality disorder. So the specialty began to emerge over time. It's kind of like putting together a puzzle for me. And I love the work because it's really rewarding to see people shift from, really being trapped and having a lot of trauma to shifting into freedom and more control over their lives.
That's really wonderful. I would love if you could define really quickly for our viewers what narcissistic abuse is, what narcissistic personalities are and look like. I think that word is thrown around a lot in our just everyday conversation and pop culture.
Absolutely is thrown around a lot, and not every person that's difficult or every person that we break up with or have a problem with is a narcissist, but there's some defining traits. And narcissists are typically, there's a pervasive pattern of lack of empathy and exploitation. And so, how that sort of translates into their relationships is there is also another pervasive pattern of manipulation and control. Another term for that is coercive control. And I'll also often tell people, I'm not sure that the person that you're dealing with is a narcissist, but if they have enough traits, that's all that matters, right? It's the behavior, not the diagnosis. And, some of the typical words that are thrown around, because it is true that these are some of the sort of defining patterns are things like gaslighting, triangulation, projection. And gaslighting is where the narcissist makes the victim doubt their reality. And that's a really tough thing to deal with. It's very isolating, and you lose touch with your own judgment of the world around you. And that's like one of the more challenging dynamics and sort of emotional abuse types that is harder to deal with. But once you work through that and learn how to trust your judgment again, someone's really on the path to healing.
How does narcissistic abuse impact a person's mental and emotional health, both in the short term and then over a long period of time?
That's a good question. And in the short term, people often experience distress like anxiety, depression, panic, insomnia. Really, one of the biggest things that I see is people start to question their reality, and they start to work harder to try and bring back the connection that they may have once felt during the love bombing or the honeymoon phase. It's very draining and very exhausting. Over time, this builds up into things like complex PTSD, health issues, self doubt. And I think one of the worst parts is isolation. One of the worst parts of any type of abuse is the isolation of the victim. So it really can pervasively affect many areas of a person's life. The sad thing is I work with people early on in these dynamics in their lives, and then also people, in their 50s, 60s, even 70s and 80s. And what I see are certain health problems that often come up after many years of narcissistic abuse, like autoimmune disease and cancers and things like that. There is some correlation with long-term stress, such as being in an abusive relationship and those types of diseases. So it's never too late, but these dynamics can really wreak havoc on a person's health and their mental and emotional well-being.
I feel like we always hear about the mind body connection, but it's really fascinating to hear about how almost maybe not linear, but how you can often see almost a direct result of being in a prolonged narcissistic abuse situation, or just being in a situation of narcissistic abuse and not having the opportunity or resources to address it and heal from it. It's really sad, but like you said, it's never too late. And I think
Yeah.
that is also equally as inspiring and gives a lot of hope for people.
Yeah, I think it's never too late. I mean, I've worked with people in their 70s and even 80s that have gotten divorced or broken off contact from an abusive person, and just the whole new lease on life is great. And if you're under that prolonged stress, our bodies aren't meant to be, we're meant to like fight a saber-toothed tiger and then run away from it. You know what I mean? We are not meant to be sleeping in the same bed with or under the same roof with someone that makes us feel this way. And eventually our bodies will kind of turn on themselves and start really wearing down by having that prolonged cortisol and adrenaline release that goes along with being in constant fight, flight, or freeze mode.
Just a question I thought about as you were speaking. I am always curious about intergenerational trauma and how narcissistic abuse can impact future generations. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you might see that in your practice, whether that, like, your clients are descendants of narcissistic abuse, or if they have,
Yes.
or if they're sort of the middle person who was the victim of narcissistic abuse themselves, and how they deal with that with having their own family one day, if they choose to have a family.
We see that so much. So there's obviously nature and nurture components to intergenerational abuse. And if you are, and I love doing genograms with people. That's part of my training as a family therapist. And a genogram is basically a family tree where you include all of the dynamics, the interpersonal dynamics. If someone's an alcoholic, if someone was abusive, if someone was cut off from another person, if someone was enmeshed. And so you probably would not be surprised to know that there are generations of this. And so what happens is, if you are raised by narcissists or someone that was abused by a narcissist, you are going to learn that your only response is to stay, is to give into it. And then, of course, there are studies that show people that are descended from people that had PTSD or went through traumatic experiences, their threshold for PTSD is much, much lower. It's almost like that trauma is passed down genetically, which I've seen over and over and over again. And interestingly enough, the other dynamic that I think makes people very prone to narcissistic abuse. So I think it's sort of a couple different categories. One is being raised by a narcissist or having a grandparent that's a narcissist or a sibling. And the other one is having family that are very, very, very good people that sort of believe all people are good. And when people are being mean, they're just sad or angry people, or something bad happened to them, or they're having a bad day. And so it's sort of like two sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. So people that have really been entrenched in some of these really awful, very difficult to treat, very difficult to shift patterns. And then people that had amazing, almost picture, storybook childhood, they have no tools to understand, identify with, or deal with people that are probably not going to get better, most likely going to get worse, and continue to manipulate and harm them.
That kind of hit me, what you were talking about, the two ends of the spectrum. Of, you kind of see maybe the ideal would be having no experience with any sort of narcissistic figure, but then on the other hand, you're not really prepared or equipped or aware of what it looks like when you do. I mean, hopefully you won't, but when you inevitably do encounter a narcissist or narcissistic behavior, or God forbid, narcissistic abuse in the future, you're just less used to it. So, I mean, it's hard, because which one do you prefer? Do you prefer to be kind of, I mean, not that you prefer, ideally, we live in a world without narcissists, but I don't think that would ever happen.
Agreed. I know, that would be so nice. People often feel so awful if they have a child with someone that's a narcissist, and they'll really beat themselves up and sort of say, my child has to be, this is their other parent, and now they're struggling with this. And one of the things that I reframe is like, at least your child is going to, with the right support, is going to be able to understand what this personality type is and how to deal with it from an early age. And I think that that is, one of the sort of silver lining, hidden blessings sort of things of being raised in a family like that. If one person gets better, and learns how to set boundaries and learns how to call out the patterns for what they are and detach from them as much as possible, other people can make those choices too. And, they, unfortunately, it does not seem like narcissists are going anywhere. I feel like, narcissists are described way back in literature from the beginning of the time. Like, I feel like even in the Bible, there's certain, dynamics. I'm like, oh my gosh, that is a narcissist for sure that they're talking about. So
Yeah.
always been people and always will be. And so I think it's just having the tools to recognize it. I think the other hard thing is people want to be able to learn to see it coming and see the signs like super early. It's really hard to do that. Narcissists or, antagonistic personalities, a whole aspect of their personality is tricking people. It's mirroring back to people what they want to see or hear so they can get something from that person. And so you really often can't see at first that this person might be someone that's out to take advantage of you. You have to sort of see a pattern of it. I know I've trained with Dr. Ramani, and she talks about the 3 strikes and you're out rule. And I think there's sort of some truth and fairness to that.
So earlier we defined narcissistic abuse, but I was wondering if you could describe some common experiences that survivors of narcissistic abuse face, such as being dismissed or gaslighted, and if you feel comfortable sharing any sort of examples that might be common that anyone who might be watching this kind of hear and think to themselves, I've seen that in one relationship or another, or observed it from afar.
Gaslighting is super common. I think we touched on that. That is where the victims or the target's reality is dismissed, invalidated, or downplayed. Another thing is something called triangulation, and that's where a third party, like a friend, a family member, or even an affair partner, are sort of like brought in to gang up against the other person. Sometimes you'll hear the term flying monkeys, and flying monkeys are sort of deployed in against like someone that's trying to stand up to or set boundaries with a narcissist to try and coerce them back. Another common, and just as an aside with the triangulation and the flying monkeys, it's really important to find therapists that are familiar with this pattern, because typical therapist training sees all problems as shared problems, all interpersonal problems as shared problems. And when there's abuse, what that actually does is that enables the narcissist more. And it can actually make things worse. So now you've got a situation where the therapist doesn't really see what's going on, and they're sort of co-signing and encouraging the narcissist behavior. Because they don't really understand the dynamics themselves. And abuse is never a shared issue. Abuse, the responsibility always lies squarely on the shoulders of the abuser. And then another typical dynamic is something called DARVO, which stands for deny and reverse victim and offender. And DARVO is when a narcissist denies that, or an antagonistic or abusive person denies that they've done anything wrong. They accuse their target of being the abusive one, and they'll often use minor sort of examples like, well, you got upset when you found out I was cheating on you. And if you weren't so mean to me and weren't so cold, I wouldn't be cheating on you. And it's fine anyways. People do that all the time. And so it's this pattern that is, very emotionally destabilizing and confusing.
A lot of the examples you gave, I feel like I've definitely heard or seen small glimpses or seen it on TV show or just all around me, but I've never been able to put a name to what it is, whether that's triangulation or DARVO, which is a really fun, not so fun,
right?
it's a fun abbreviation. And I think something that I've noticed just listening to the examples and throughout our entire conversation so far is that the problem, I think a lot of the times with narcissists and narcissistic abuse is that it could be spun by someone who's observing from the outside as this is normal, or this just they're having a bad day, they're in a bad mood, they're under a lot of stress, but
every marriage is hard.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they don't see the pervasive pattern that you were saying, that like the aspect of it being a pattern is what makes it inherently abusive. So I think having the right therapist who can understand and validate and know, like you said, that it's not a shared responsibility, it's
Yes.
really, really important.
I absolutely agree. And it is, you're right. It's so easy to say, well, everyone has a bad day and every marriage is hard and nobody's perfect. And absolutely all of that is true. But when you see this pervasive pattern, and the other thing that goes along with that pervasive pattern is the person showing accountability, not just paying lip service to it, but really showing behaviors that show that they're taking accountability and making steps to protect their loved ones, from, maybe some of their challenging behavior or just hurting them. So the other thing is narcissists can be really good at talking a great game and, giving these extensive apologies, but does the behavior back up those apologies and show that they're sorry? So, and yeah, it's super confusing to have friends or family sort of denying it or downplaying it. And then it's even worse when unfortunately a therapist does too.
In your experience, how can therapy help survivors begin to heal and rebuild their sense of self after narcissistic abuse?
So therapy, I always tell people therapy is hard. You have to grieve the relationship. It's not fun to stir things up. Sometimes things can get a little bit worse as the abuser realizes you're setting boundaries, or even if you cut off contact. But it's also hard to stay in a long-term relationship with a narcissist. So I always say pick the hard that's going to give you the best outcome, that's going to give you, some healing and peace in your life. So therapy can help a person reclaim their sense of self. And when I say that, I mean they can start to trust their gut again. I always tell people that's like one of the slowest things to come around. But once you see that and it like clicks into place, it feels so amazing. Good therapy will also help people switch out of fight, flight, or freeze brain, which is their amygdala, which is constantly looking for threat cues, and have their nervous system become more regulated so that they can use their hippocampus, which is their ability to think more rationally and creatively. And so when the amygdala is constantly on, it almost becomes a habit. It's hard to think about things in a creative, rational way. And so we want to help people slip back into the ability to use that part of their brain again. We also help people, explore options on moving forward. Sometimes you can't cut that narcissist out of your life. Like sometimes your kids are super little and it might not be good to leave that person if they're going to get 50-50 custody. Or, maybe that is the best choice, but helping people weigh out all the options, understanding that there's usually not one perfect way or one all good or all bad way to move forward. Sometimes that narcissist or antagonistic person is a parent or a sibling. So figuring out if you have to stay in contact with that person moving forward, how to manage those dynamics so you can stay as regulated as possible. And even if that person is, say, a parent, how do you have a reasonably decent relationship with that person? Plus protect yourself and keep your boundaries up. So it can be complicated, but it's very doable and so rewarding to see people heal and then, open themselves up to have some space for other healthy relationships in their lives.
Something that I thought about as you were speaking just now was how you said that when someone is starting to heal from narcissistic abuse and they're doing the work in therapy, they get their gut reactions, their gut sense back, they get out of fight, flight, freeze, they get their creativity back. That made me think about how it must be when they're actually in the trenches of abuse before they're able to really heal. And it made me think about depression and are survivors of narcissistic abuse, when they're still going through that abuse and in those situations, are they all depressed? What's the like correlation between the two? And how do you sort of both distinguish those two issues of trauma versus depression, but know that they could ultimately go hand in hand?
Absolutely do go hand in hand. But generally speaking, and again, not always, because some folks just have a genetic predisposition for major depressive disorder. Generally speaking, the type of depression that somebody who has been the focus of narcissistic abuse, it's more like a pattern where their nervous system kind of revs up into anxiety, panic, insomnia, and then it crashes into depression. So you sort of see this sort of cyclical pattern, and the depression is more of a function of that nervous system being exhausted from being constantly on alert or feeling like they're constantly under threat. So it is a little bit different. Some of the treatments are the same, but definitely getting a good, thorough background and a good picture of what that person, if someone presents to me as depressed, I want to get a good clinical background and a good, thorough picture of what's going on in their lives, who their support people are, how they've functioned over the past few years. To sort of help me understand, is this major depressive disorder or clinical depression? Or is this trauma from some type of long-term abuse pattern? Or, is it a little bit of both?
To wrap up, what guidance or encouragement would you offer to someone who feels hopeless or lost in the aftermath of narcissistic abuse?
Yeah. And again, I recognize that therapy isn't easy, but it's also not easy staying in this type of pattern. Sometimes people hang in there hoping, like, well, when the kids get older, it'll get better. Or if I, achieve this, that, or the other thing, I'll finally get that person's approval and they'll stop targeting me. And it typically does not work that way. Over time, narcissistic abuse typically doesn't get better. It typically gets worse. And so even though therapy is hard, at least at the end of that journey, there's healing, there's room for boundaries, there's room for new healthy relationships, there's room to be yourself again. So I really encourage people, if they feel that draw to like look at what's going on. I'm the type of therapist, I'm not going to push anyone to leave their partner or cut somebody off. I really want my clients to find their own answers, because that's a big part of healing too, is they're the expert in their lives. How do I empower them to really know that and make choices based on that?
That's really powerful. Thank you. I just wanted to say that I learned a lot over this call, and I really appreciate you being here and taking the time. And I know that whoever is watching right now really gained a lot of information and would be really lucky to work with you and heal with you.
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that and taking the time today to talk to me. So thank you.